Chosen one. There is a warning that needed to reach you before anything else. Not a warning of danger, but a warning of awareness. Something moved against what was meant for you. A deliberate attempt was made to intercept, redirect, or claim what carries your name. And what you need to hear right now in this moment is not what was lost. What you need to hear is this: the warning is not being issued because they succeeded. It is being issued because they tried. You have been carrying the weight of what feels like loss. A door that closed when it should have opened. An opportunity that dissolved without explanation. A relationship that ended before it bore fruit. A season of silence that no one could prepare you for. And somewhere in the accumulating evidence of what did not work out, something quiet shifted inside you. Maybe the blessing passed to someone else. Maybe the window closed. Maybe your name was moved. But this message arrives as both a warning and a confirmation in the same breath. Archangel Michael does not bring warnings for blessings that no longer exist. He brings warnings for what is still alive, still real, still carrying a name. That name is yours. The attempt was made, the interference was real, but what was sealed with your name on it cannot be claimed, transferred, or erased by anyone who did not write it. You are still the addressee. You have always been. What happened in the season that left you unsure, that is where we need to begin. Think about the moment you first noticed something wasn't opening the way you expected. Not the dramatic collapse necessarily. Sometimes it was quieter than that. A yes that became a maybe that became a silence. A connection that had real weight, and then without a clear reason you could point to, began to thin out. A path you were walking that simply stopped producing results, as if the ground itself had changed beneath you without announcing that it was going to. You kept walking because you did not know what else to do, but the feedback stopped. The confirmation stopped, and slowly, without choosing to, you began to wonder whether you had misread the whole thing from the beginning. That wondering is not faithlessness. Let me be clear about that. The person who wonders whether they misread the map is not the same as the person who stopped caring where they were going. You are still here. You still showed up for this message, which means some part of you has not closed the book on what was promised. That part of you deserves to be heard before any other voice in the room gets to weigh in. Here is what I want you to consider. A warning is only issued for what is still in motion. Think about how warnings work in any context. You don't issue a warning for something that has already ended. You issue a warning because there is something still active, still present, still relevant to the person receiving the message. The warning being sent to you right now is not a retrospective. It is not Archangel Michael looking back on something that used to exist. A warning by its nature speaks to something current, something that still has your name attached to it, something that an attempt was made to intercept, and that for reasons we will explore together was not intercepted successfully. But before we get to what remained, there is something about what was attempted that matters. Because the nature of the opposition, what it targeted when it moved, how it moved, is not random. Opposition does not spend itself on what is empty. Think about anything worth protecting in your life, and you will find that it attracted some form of interference. The things that were inconsequential slipped away quietly, and no one came after them. The things that had weight, the things aligned with purpose, with calling, with something deeper than preference, those were the ones that experienced resistance. This does not mean every difficulty you have encountered is spiritual warfare. Discernment is required. Not everything that was hard was a targeted attack, and treating every obstacle as an enemy move will exhaust you and distort your perception. But when you look back at the season of blocking you have been living through, and you look specifically at what was blocked, not everything, but this particular thing, ask yourself, was it random or was it specific? The sealed letter does not attract interceptors because it is empty. It attracts them because of what it contains and because of the name written on the outside. The interference says something about the value of what is inside, and the fact that the interference has not succeeded in changing the name says something even more specific, something about the authority behind the writing. You are beginning to understand what this warning is actually saying. Not that you are in danger, not that something is about to be taken, but that an attempt was made, the attempt was real, and it did not work. Your name is still on what was set apart for you. The warning arrives so that you can stop living as though it isn't. That is where we are beginning. And there is much more to understand, because the nature of the blocking and the silence that followed it, and what has been happening all along inside that silence, are not what you have told yourself they are. There is something I need to name before we go any further, something that has been present in you since the season of blocking began, something you may not have allowed yourself to say out loud, because saying it would make it feel more real than you wanted it to be. You started to believe the blocking worked. Not all at once. It wasn't a single moment where you decided to give up. It was slower than that. It was the accumulation of days that passed without the thing opening. It was watching other people step into what you were waiting for and telling yourself that meant they were supposed to have it, not you. It was the quiet internal renegotiation, the one where you began to speak of the blessing in past tense, not as something coming, but as something that didn't come, as something you misunderstood, as something you wanted so badly you convinced yourself it was promised when maybe it wasn't, and maybe the silence was simply the universe correcting for your misreading. That is the wound. Not the external opposition itself, but what you concluded from it. And I want you to hear me carefully here. The conclusion was understandable. You were not weak for drawing it. You were responding to evidence. You prayed alone in the early morning or the late night when no one was watching, when the only witness to what you were asking for was the one you were asking. You cried alone in the specific way that comes when you are too tired to perform composure, and there is no one present to ask you if you are okay. You held on to something in private for longer than seemed reasonable because releasing it felt like the kind of loss you had to be ready for, and you were not ready. And then somewhere in the holding, you quietly began to grieve it as though it was already gone. That grief was appropriate for the season. The season was real, the cost of it was real, the loneliness of carrying something that no one around you could see or confirm that was real. You are not being asked to pretend any of that away. But here is the distinction that changes everything. There is a difference between grieving a process and concluding that the grief is evidence of permanent cancellation. Grief says, "This has been hard, and the hardness has cost me something, and I need time and space to acknowledge the cost." That is honest. That is healthy. That is the appropriate response to a season that took something from you, even if what it took was not the blessing itself, but the ease of believing in it. Conclusion says the grief is proof that I was wrong. The silence is proof that the answer is no. The resistance is proof that I was never the intended recipient. That is where the wound lives, not in the feeling, but in what the feeling was allowed to decide. Consider for a moment what you were actually carrying during that season. The prayers said in private, the preparation that happened in the background that no one asked you about, the specific kind of faith that operates without any external confirmation, without anyone holding your hand through the uncertainty, without a single voice in your immediate environment telling you that what you were waiting for was still real. You carried that, and the carrying itself in the quiet, in the absence of confirmation, was not weakness. It was formation. What is formed in private cannot be formed in public. There are things that the presence of witnesses changes, sometimes for the better, sometimes by removing the very conditions necessary for something to take root. The blessing that was being developed in that season may have required precisely the absence of external confirmation, not because you were forgotten, but because what was being built in you could only be built that way. The soil for certain things has to be prepared in silence. That is not poetry. Think about anything you have ever built carefully, anything you were serious about developing. There was almost certainly a period where it existed only in you, before it was visible to anyone else, before it had enough form to be shown. And if anyone had tried to rush that period, to force it into public too soon, it would not have survived. Some things have to be protected in their early stages by the very silence that makes the waiting feel like loss. The tears you cried in private were not evidence of divine distance. They were the mark of a season that required you to hold something in the dark close without confirmation, because that is the only condition in which certain things develop into what they are meant to become. The prayers said alone were heard, not despite the privacy, but within it. Now I want to ask you something that will matter for everything that follows. The things that were blocked during this season, were they all the same kind of thing, or did the blocking seem specific? Did everything in your life feel equally obstructed, or was it this particular thread, the one most directly connected to what you understand your calling to be, that experienced the persistent resistance? Because the answer to that question is the beginning of seeing the pattern that has been hidden in plain sight. When you look at the blocking with clear eyes, not through the grief of the season, but with the specific question of what exactly was targeted, something becomes difficult to ignore. It was not everything. It was this. Not every area of your life entered a period of unexplained obstruction. Not every door in front of you stopped opening. Not every relationship grew complicated. Not every opportunity dissolved. Not every path narrowed. Something else happened, something specific. The resistance gathered itself around the thing most connected to what you carry, the calling, the purpose, the sense of something you were supposed to be moving toward. Other things in your life remained relatively stable, but this particular thread attracted a quality of interference that was disproportionate to everything else. That specificity is the pattern, and the pattern is the message. Here is what opposition characteristically does not do. It does not waste energy on what is empty. Think about this carefully. You do not station a guard at a door that leads to nothing. You do not intercept a letter that contains nothing of value. You do not apply sustained specific pressure against something that was never going to amount to anything. Opposition moves against assignment. It targets what is real. It concentrates itself around what is meaningful, what carries weight, what is pointed in a direction that matters. This is not an invitation to interpret every difficulty as a spiritual attack. It bears repeating, not every obstacle is opposition, and treating life that way leads to paranoia rather than discernment. Ordinary hardship exists. Doors close for practical reasons. Relationships end because of human complexity that has nothing to do with spiritual warfare. Discernment means holding all of that with nuance. But when you look at the specific pattern of what was blocked, and you see that it was not random, that it was concentrated around the thing most directly connected to purpose, that it persisted in a way that other difficulties did not, the pattern deserves your attention. Not to make you afraid, not to make you feel persecuted, but to ask the question that the pattern is actually answering. What kind of opposition targets something that does not exist? If the blessing were not real, if the calling were a misreading, if the name on the appointment were not yours, if what you had been preparing for was simply the result of your own wishful thinking, there would be nothing to block. Cancelled appointments do not require blocking. They simply disappear. They don't attract sustained resistance because there is nothing there to resist. The absence of a blessing is its own resolution. Nothing needs to come and take it. But contested doors are different. A contested door still belongs to someone. The contest is precisely because the ownership is recognized. When you look at what was blocked and you ask not why did this fall apart, but why did this attract the specific quality of interference, it did. You are asking the question the season has actually been answering all along. Consider what you know about how things work in this world. The things with the most potential tend to face the most resistance at the point of emergence. The idea with real impact meets the most opposition in its early stages, before it has enough form to defend itself. The relationship with real depth draws the most disruptive interference at its most vulnerable point. The calling with genuine weight becomes visible to forces of interference precisely because it has weight. The specificity of the targeting is not coincidence, it is recognition. What moved against your blessing recognized your name before you fully did. That sentence might be difficult to sit with. It was not comfortable for me to say, but consider what it means. The interference was specific enough, sustained enough, concentrated enough around what you carry that it operated as a form of acknowledgement, an unwilling adversarial acknowledgement, but acknowledgement nonetheless. Something saw what was on the outside of the letter and moved to intercept it because of the name written there. The name that was on it then is the same name that is on it now. Nothing about the name has changed. Now here is where the practical question enters. If the blessing was real enough to attract targeted interference, what happened to it when the interference came? Did the blocking succeed, or did the blessing simply move through a different route? Because those are not the same outcome, and they do not produce the same future. One story ends with it's gone, the other story continues. You have been living in the first story. You adopted the grief of the season as the conclusion of the story, not because you chose to give up, but because the evidence of the blocking felt like the only reasonable interpretation. But the evidence of the blocking is actually evidence of something else. It is evidence that the assignment is real. It is evidence that what you were holding on to in those private, unconfirmed, exhausting months of waiting was not a fantasy. It was contested because it was real. It was blocked because it was yours. And the blocking did not have the authority to change the name on what it was trying to take. The question of where the blessing went during the season of obstruction, what it has been doing while you waited in silence, that is what we are going to examine next. Because what feels like nothing happening is rarely nothing. The silence that came after the blocking is the part of the story that people rarely talk about honestly. The opposition itself has a certain drama to it. Something moves against you, something closes. There is a moment of loss with a shape and a weight you can describe. But what comes after is harder to articulate. The after is quiet in a way that feels enormous. And the quiet raises a question that the drama of the opposition did not prepare you for. Is anything still happening? Because from inside the silence, the answer is not obvious. You cannot hear the mechanisms of what is being held in trust. You cannot see the route the blessing is taking around the points where interception was attempted. You cannot access any confirmation that the process is still moving. All you have is the silence, vast, unexplained and expensive, in the specific way that costs you the thing you were not told you would have to spend, the assumption that forward motion should feel like forward motion. There is a particular kind of faith that operates in the silence after opposition, and it is different from the faith that operates in ordinary waiting. Ordinary waiting has a quality of expectation. You know something is coming, and you are simply marking time until it arrives. The silence after opposition is different because the uncertainty is real. You genuinely do not know whether the blessing is still in transit or whether the blocking succeeded. The silence does not provide evidence either way, and faith that operates in genuine uncertainty without external confirmation, without the comfort of a visible trajectory, that is the most costly kind of faith there is. What I want to offer you is not a bypass around that cost. The cost was real, the season was hard, but I want to give you a framework for understanding what the silence has actually been. Think about the letter metaphor again. The letter carries your name, and it is in transit, addressed, real, moving. But the direct route to the destination was contested. Someone identified the address, recognized the name, and positioned themselves to intercept. When the letter reached that point, it was not lost. It was rerouted. It took the longer path, the less visible path, the path that bypasses the points where the interception was waiting. From your perspective, the perspective of the person waiting for the delivery, the silence of the longer route is indistinguishable from the silence of nothing happening. You cannot see that it is still moving. You can only feel the waiting. But here is the critical thing. The silence of the rerouted blessing is not the same as the silence of the cancelled one. Both feel the same from inside the waiting. Both produce the same uncertainty, the same inability to confirm that anything is still in motion. But they are not the same silence, and the story they belong to is not the same story. The silence you have been living in has been asking you a question without giving you the answer. And the question has been shaping you, not through the dramatic intensity of the opposition itself that had its own shaping, but through this, the question of whether you would continue to carry what you were carrying after every external confirmation had gone quiet. Whether the thing you believed in was still real to you in the absence of any visible evidence. Whether you had the kind of faith that does not require feedback to remain active. That formation does not happen in public. It cannot happen in a season where every prayer is answered quickly and every door opens at the first knock. It requires exactly the conditions you have been living in the private prayers, the unexplained delays, the experience of continuing to hold something that other people would have released by now. What is being formed in you through the silence is a quality of conviction and discernment that cannot be developed in easier circumstances. The silence is not the absence of divine involvement. It is the condition in which a particular kind of divine involvement becomes possible. This is not to say that every season of silence is productive or that you should remain in a pattern that is genuinely harmful to you in the name of faith. Discernment is required here as it is everywhere. The difference between a season of formation and a season of avoidance is something only honest self-examination can reveal. Are you in the silence because you are being held in trust? Or are you in the silence because something in you is afraid to take the next step that is already available? Both can feel like waiting. Only one of them is. But if what you are carrying has a genuine connection to calling, if what was blocked was specific and purposeful, if the opposition was not random, then the silence that followed was not the sound of the blessing disappearing. It was the sound of the blessing being moved around the interference. The route is longer. The waiting is more expensive. But the name on the letter has not changed. What has been happening in the silence is not nothing. Something has been traveling, and something has been forming in you that makes this moment, the moment of the warning, the moment of the awareness possible. The silence was preparing you to receive what you could not have received without it. The question now is what you do when the silence begins to lift, when the warning arrives and invites you to see what has actually been in motion all this time. Archangel Michael does not bring warnings without purpose, and the warning that is being given to you now carries a specific message that is easy to misread. Not because the message is obscure, but because fear and awareness feel almost identical in the body, and most of us have learned to respond to both the same way. Fear says, brace yourself. Something bad is happening or is about to happen. The appropriate response is defense, closure, vigilance against the worst possible outcome. Awareness says, pay attention. Something real is happening and you need to understand it clearly so that you can respond with wisdom rather than reaction. These two states feel the same from the inside. Your heart rate rises with both. The sense of heightened alertness is present in both, but they lead in completely different directions. Fear leads to paralysis, to circling the known, to avoiding the next step, to building walls around what you have left, rather than moving toward what is still yours. Awareness leads to clarity, to seeing the situation as it actually is, not as it feels in the worst interpretation, and to making decisions from that clarity. The warning Archangel Michael is issuing is not a message of fear. It is a message of awareness. Be aware someone moved against what was meant for you. Be aware the move was real. Be aware it did not succeed. Be aware your name is still on what was set apart. All four of those statements are part of the same warning, and they only make sense together. A warning that tells you the first two things without the last two would be incomplete and cruel. A warning that leads you to fear without leading you to clarity would not serve you. This warning is not incomplete. It arrives with all four statements, and the last two are the ones that change what the first two mean. Think for a moment about what kind of warning is appropriate for what is still intact. If your home were already on fire, the message you would receive is not a warning, it is an emergency. If the blessing had already been permanently removed, the message you would receive would not be a warning either. It would be a different kind of message entirely, a message of redirection, of what comes next, of beginning again. A warning is specifically the message appropriate to what is current, what is active, what is still in motion, and requires your informed engagement. The warning is arriving now because you are at the point in your journey where you can receive it with clarity rather than with fear. Earlier in the season, if someone had told you that an active attempt was made to block your blessing, you may not have been in a position to hear it correctly. You might have heard it as confirmation of your worst fear, that you were being fought against, without having the framework to understand what the contest actually reveals about the value of what was being contested. You needed the formation of the silence first. You needed to carry the thing without confirmation, to develop the kind of faith that does not depend on external feedback, before you could receive this message and read it as awareness rather than as alarm. You are reading it now, and the reading changes what comes next. Here is the specific understanding that awareness requires in your situation. There is a difference between being warned and being defeated. You may have spent the season of blocking feeling as though the warning and the defeat were the same thing, as though the very fact of interference meant you had lost. But being warned is what happens when something is still yours and someone has moved against it. Defeat is what happens when what was contested is actually taken. The interference was real, the blocking was real, the contest was real. None of that means defeat was the outcome. The warning you are receiving now is not retroactive news about a loss that already happened. It is current intelligence about what has been happening, a revelation of the landscape, so that you can move through it with your eyes open, rather than with the fog of the grief narrative still distorting your vision. The fog said the blocking worked. The warning says the blocking was attempted. Those are not the same statement. There is also a discernment layer here that matters practically. Not every voice that tries to tell you the blocking succeeded is coming from outside of you. Some of the most persistent and convincing voices are internal, the accumulation of unanswered prayers that felt like silence from the divine, the experiences of doors closing that your mind organized into a pattern of exclusion, the quiet internal narrator that has been building a case for why the loss makes sense. That narrator is not your enemy. It was doing its best to protect you from the continued cost of believing in something that appeared to be gone. But that narrator has been working from incomplete information. It did not have access to what was happening in the silence. It did not have the framework to distinguish between a cancelled appointment and a rerouted one. It was reading the evidence available to it, the blocking, the silence, the apparent absence of forward motion, and drawing the most logical available conclusion. The warning is arriving to give the narrator new information, not to dismiss the evidence it was working with, but to recontextualize what that evidence actually means. You do not have to stop trusting your discernment. You have to feed it better data. And the data the warning is providing changes the conclusion. your name remaining is not just a statement about the future status of the blessing. It is a statement about who you are right now. This distinction matters more than it might initially seem because we tend to receive messages about preservation and remaining in a purely transactional way, as though your name remains means only what you were waiting for is still in the pipeline. And while that is true, it is not the deepest truth in the statement. The deepest truth is about identity, not inventory. Consider what it takes for a name to remain through an active attempt to remove it. It is not passive. It is not automatic. A name that remains through opposition carries a different kind of weight than a name that was simply never challenged. The survival of the name through what moved against it is itself a testimony to the authority behind the writing. Something held it there. Not the strength of the person whose name it is. You were not strong enough on your own to prevent the opposition from doing what it tried to do. What held the name was the authority of the one who wrote it, and that authority does not waver based on what circumstances appear to be saying. But here is what this means for how you understand yourself right now in this season before the blessing has fully arrived. Your identity is not defined by the opposition. Your identity is defined by the name, and the name has held. The season of blocking did not change your address. It did not alter the assignment. It moved against your circumstances, against your timeline, against your peace, against your confidence. But the name written in the place that the opposition could not access that name is intact. Let me give this some grounding in what you may have actually experienced. You have probably encountered at some point in the season of blocking people who tried to redefine who you were. A relationship that over time rewrote your narrative for you, that said in ways direct or indirect that you were not the kind of person to whom the thing you were reaching for would come. A rejection that tried to write you out of a story you were supposed to be part of. A failure that tried to become your identity rather than your experience. You know what it feels like to have someone attempt to change the name on what you are carrying, and you know that the attempt does not automatically succeed just because it was made. The same principle applies at the spiritual level. An attempt to remove your name from what was set apart for you does not succeed just because the attempt was made. The authority required to rewrite the name is specific, and it is not available to those who moved against you. They saw the name, they moved against it precisely because they saw it, but they did not have the access necessary to change it. And so the name remains, not because you held onto it tightly enough, not because you were faithful enough during the hardest parts of the season, but because the one who wrote it holds it, and that holding is not contingent on your performance during the opposition. This matters for the wound at the center of the season. The wound said, maybe the blocking worked because I was never really the intended recipient. Maybe I convinced myself of something that was never true. Maybe the opposition succeeded because I did not have what it took to hold the blessing. If the wound's narrative were accurate, then your name would have been removable. The opposition would have had the access it needed to rewrite the addressee. But the wound's narrative has a fundamental problem. The name is still there. And a name that held through what moved against it is telling you something about who did the holding. Here is the practical weight of this. You have probably spent part of the silent season operating from the wound's narrative rather than from the truth of the remaining name. And that operating has had real consequences, not dramatic ones necessarily, but the quiet kind that add up. You may have explained yourself more than necessary to people who questioned the calling. You may have sought permission implicitly or explicitly from people who witnessed the season of blocking as though their assessment of the situation were more authoritative than what you knew internally. You may have begun to hold back some portion of what you were willing to invest in the direction of the blessing as a kind of self-protective hedge against the possibility that it really was gone. All of these are understandable responses to the season, and none of them reflect the truth of what your name remains means. The remaining name is not only a promise about what is coming, it is a present tense statement about who you are and what still belongs to you in the unseen. The assignment did not expire during the opposition. The calling did not lapse while the interference was active. The purpose has not been reassigned. You are right now, in this moment, the person whose name is on what was set apart, and no season of blocking, however long and however costly, has changed that. This is the foundation for what comes next, because what you are about to understand, the full revelation about what the blocking actually means, requires you to be standing on this foundation first, not on the hope that the name is still there, on the recognition that it is. Everything we have built together so far has been leading to this, and I want you to sit with it carefully, because what I am about to say will try to move quickly through you. The mind wants to process it fast and file it away before the full weight of it can land. Don't let it. Let this arrive slowly. The attempts to block your blessing are not evidence that the blessing was lost. They are the most direct evidence available that the blessing is real. Read that again, because the reversal is complete, and it changes everything about how you interpret the season you have been living in. Real things attract interference. Cancelled appointments do not require blocking, they simply disappear. They don't draw sustained, specific, targeted resistance because there is nothing there to resist. The absence of a blessing resolves itself. Nothing needs to come and take it, or reroute it, or contest it, because it is already gone. But the thing that has your name on it, the thing that is still addressed to you, still real, still moving through its long route around the interception points, that thing attracted the interference precisely because it was real. Because it carried your name, because the forces that tried to block it recognized your name before you had the full framework to recognize it yourself. You have been reading your own story from the wrong end. The story you have been telling yourself is the story of what was taken, of what was promised and blocked and apparently lost. The evidence you have been working with is the evidence of opposition, the closed door, the failed relationship, the dissolved opportunity, the silence of the in-between. And you organized all of that evidence into a conclusion that felt logical. The blocking succeeded. I misread what was promised. The blessing is not mine. But here is what that story got backwards. The evidence of the blocking is not evidence of the blessing's absence. It is evidence of the blessing's presence. Real presence. Specific presence. The kind of presence that was significant enough to attract interference at the moment it was most vulnerable, emerging, developing, not yet fully formed enough to be visible to others, but already visible enough to be recognized by what moved against it. Let that land. What moved against you, whatever the nature of the opposition was, however it showed up in your life, it recognized something about what you were carrying before you fully did. It moved against it at its most vulnerable moment, not because you were weak, but because what you were carrying was real and its emergence was imminent. The interference was in its own perverse way a form of confirmation. This is the reversal that changes everything. You have been interpreting the blocking as evidence of your own unsuitability, that the opposition succeeded because you were never truly the right person for what was promised, but the opposition moved against you because you were exactly the right person. The targeting was specific, the interference was real, and neither of those things would have been present if what you were carrying was simply the product of wishful thinking. I want to be clear about what this does not mean. It does not mean that every difficulty you have ever experienced was spiritually motivated opposition to your blessing. It does not mean that anyone who caused you pain in the season of blocking was a conscious instrument of something against you. It does not mean that you are now exempt from growth, accountability, or the ordinary human work of examining your own patterns and taking responsibility for what you contributed to the difficulties you experienced. Being the person whose name held is not the same as being the person who was always right. The chosen identity calls you to humility, to discernment, to honest self-reflection, not to a story where you were simply the victim of forces against you. What the reversal means is this: the conclusion you drew from the evidence that the blessing was gone was based on a misreading of what the evidence actually said. The evidence said the blessing was real and was being contested. You read it as the blessing was lost. The difference between those two readings is everything, and the difference determines what comes next. If the blessing was lost, then you are waiting for something to be restored, for a process of recovery and reconstruction to begin for what was taken to be returned. That is one kind of posture and one kind of waiting. If the blessing was contested but is intact, then you are not waiting for restoration. You are standing at the edge of recognition, the moment of understanding what has been in motion all along and beginning to align with it. That is a completely different posture, and it produces completely different movement. The season the viewer has been calling the season of loss is the season in which the most important confirmation of the blessing's reality was happening in the specific, targeted, sustained nature of what moved against it. The interference did not prove the name was wrong. The interference proved the name was right. It was the most unwilling adversarial form of confirmation the viewer could have received. But it was confirmation nonetheless. Your name is not a draft, it is not a placeholder, it is not provisional pending the resolution of the season. It was written with authority by the one who had the authority to write it, and what moved against it did not have the access to change it. The blocking was attempted, the name remained, and now the warning has arrived so that you can stop living in the story of what was taken and begin living in the story of what was never taken at all. The revelation that arrived in the last part was clarifying, and clarifying is different from comfortable. Because now you are standing between what you understand and how you have been living, and that gap is where the real work begins. Understanding that the blessing was not taken is one thing. The harder thing is examining what you built during the season when you believed it was, because the belief that the blocking succeeded did not stay only in your thoughts. It became a way of moving through the world. It became habits, patterns, postures that made complete sense in the story of I have been robbed, and that now need to be seen clearly in the light of the story that is actually true. Let me be specific. When you believed the blocking had worked even partially, even in the quiet way that operates below the level of conscious decision, certain things became normalized. You began to explain the delay to people who had no real context for understanding it. Not because explanation was necessary, but because some part of you was trying to rebuild your credibility in the eyes of people who had witnessed the season of apparent failure. You were offering evidence for why things hadn't worked out, as though the people around you needed a reasonable account before they would restore their confidence in what you were carrying. But consider what that explaining actually was. It was seeking permission. Permission from people who did not write your name, who did not authorize the assignment, who did not have the access to either confirm or revoke what was set apart for you to continue believing it was still yours. And the need to seek that permission was the fingerprint of the wound. It was the wound's operating system. I cannot simply believe in this anymore. I need someone else to tell me it's still real. There may also have been environments you stayed in longer than was healthy, because leaving would have required you to act as though the blessing was still worth moving toward, and moving toward it felt too expensive if the blocking had worked. Staying in environments that reinforced the loss narrative was safer. If you were already in the story of it didn't happen, you didn't have to risk the story of it still coming and face the possibility of being disappointed again. So you stayed in the conversation, in the relationship, in the internal framework, in the version of the story where staying small was the reasonable response to the season you had been through. None of this makes you a failure. Survival adaptations are not character defects. You built what made sense to survive a season that had real cost. But survival adaptations are not meant to be permanent. They are meant to carry you through the hardest part, not to become the identity you carry indefinitely after the hardest part has passed. Here is what alignment actually requires now. It requires that you stop seeking validation for your calling from the same sources that witnessed the blocking. The people who saw the door close, who were there for the silence, who had front row seats to the apparent failure, they do not have the information they would need to confirm the blessing is intact. They saw the blocking. They did not see what was being protected. Their assessment is based on incomplete data. And making their assessment the benchmark for your own confidence in what you carry is letting their limited view define your unlimited assignment. It also requires you to examine one specific area, just one where your behavior has been operating from the story of the blocking succeeded rather than from the story of the name remains. Where have you been hedging? Where have you been holding back the investment, the commitment, the full weight of belief because you were protecting yourself from the cost of being wrong again? That one area is where the alignment begins. Not across everything at once, one area, one honest examination, one concrete adjustment. And it requires a boundary, not a dramatic one, not a cutting off of everyone who questioned your calling or who reinforced the loss narrative, but a decision about how much authority those voices have going forward. A boundary that says you are welcome in my life, but you are not welcome as the arbiter of whether my name is still on what was set apart for me. That authority belongs elsewhere, and it is not available for reassignment. There is one more thing that the resistance is asking you to confront: the identity you built around the season, the specific way you have come to understand yourself as the person who experienced this, is going to feel like part of you now. And releasing it will feel like a kind of loss, even though what you are releasing is not the truth of who you are, but only the story you told yourself during the hardest part of the formation. You can grieve the season without carrying the identity of the season permanently. You can acknowledge what it cost without making the cost the definition. The cost was real. The formation was real. The season was not wasted because nothing in the formation process is wasted. But the season is not the whole story. And the next chapter requires you to put down the narrative of the interrupted blessing, not because it never happened, but because it is not how the story ends. The choice is in front of you now, not as a feeling, not waiting for a circumstance to confirm it, as a decision made with what you now understand. This is where the warning arrives at its full purpose, not to frighten you, not to put you on the defense, but to bring you to this moment, the moment of clear sight after the season of opposition and the season of silence and the season of formation, where you can finally see the whole arc of what has been happening and make the one choice that changes everything about what comes next. The central question this message has been building toward has an answer now. Did the attempts to block your blessing succeed? No. The blocking was real. The opposition was real. The cost of the season was real and significant, and it deserves to be honored, not minimized. But the blocking did not succeed in removing your name from what was set apart. The name held. It held through everything that tried to take it. And you are here in this moment, receiving the warning that confirms it, which means you are ready to choose what to do with what you now know. Here is what the choice actually looks like. It is not a grand gesture. It is not a dramatic declaration that resolves everything at once. It is a decision made quietly in the ordinary circumstances of your life to stop aligning with the story of the interrupted blessing and begin aligning with the story of the preserved name. To stop operating from the posture of someone who has been robbed and has not yet recovered. To begin operating from the posture of someone whose name held through everything that tried to remove it, and who can therefore take the next step from that truth rather than from the grief. Concretely, this means something specific for you. It means that one relationship, one environment, one internal voice that has been functioning as ongoing confirmation of the loss. Narrative loses some of its authority over how you move. You do not need to cut it off. You do not need to confront it dramatically. You need to make a decision about how much of your belief in your own calling is going to be shaped by a source that has only seen the blocking, and how much is going to be shaped by what you now understand about what the blocking did not succeed in doing. It means that one area of avoidance, one place where you have been holding back the full investment because you were protecting against the cost of being wrong, again receives a different kind of engagement. Not reckless, not without discernment, but from the assumption that the name is intact rather than the assumption that it isn't. This is not blind faith. It is informed faith based on what the evidence actually says when the evidence is read correctly. And it means something about how you carry the calling going forward. Being chosen, as this message has defined it, is not a privilege that exempts you from difficulty. It is an assignment that called you through difficulty into a specific formation that you now carry. The weight of what you hold is not evidence of inadequacy. It is evidence of what was entrusted. The responsibility of the chosen one is to be honest about that weight, to seek support when the weight requires more than individual faith to carry, to continue the work of discernment even after the major revelation has arrived, because discernment is not a one-time event. It is a practice that continues for as long as you are carrying something that matters. You do not have to have fully healed from the season before you can move from this understanding. Healing is a process, not a transaction. The grief of the season will continue to be processed. The patterns built in the silence will continue to be identified and replaced over time. The trust that was strained in the divine and in your own ability to receive what was protected for you will be rebuilt gradually and not all at once. All of that is true, and all of that is okay. The revelation does not require you to arrive fully healed before it is applicable. It only requires you to receive it and make the next decision from what you now know, rather than from what the wound told you. Chosen one, hear me now. The sealed letter is in your hands. Not because the journey was short or easy, but because the seal held through everything that tried to break it. The name on the outside is unchanged. What is inside has been preserved through the entire route it had to take to reach this moment. You are the addressee. You have always been. The opposition knew it before you fully did, and in knowing it moved against it, and in moving against it confirmed it with the most reluctant form of testimony available, the acknowledgement implicit in the attempt. You are not standing at the end of a story about what was blocked. You are standing at the beginning of the chapter that comes after the formation. The warning has been received, the revelation has arrived, and the choice now is yours. Not a choice that will be made for you by a change in circumstances, not a choice that requires all of your questions to be answered first, but a choice made with faith that has been forged in the specific conditions of your specific season and is stronger for it. Walk forward, not as someone waiting to be restored, but as someone who has been preserved. Walk with the humility of someone who understands that the assignment comes with responsibility, not privilege. Walk with the discernment you built in the silence, and walk with the quiet confidence of someone whose name held through everything that tried to remove it, because nothing that tried had the authority to do so. Your name is there. It has always been there, and it remains. If this message found you in the season that needed it, share it with someone who is carrying the same weight. And if you want to keep receiving words for where you actually are, consider subscribing. This is where the next part of your story begins.